naturally as professionals, we come into a space, we want to look polished and professional and like we know what we're talking about. And fundamentally as a dialogue, we're asking people to kind of put that aside and to grapple with a hard issue together. And really the framing is not what can you get for your organization out of this conversation, but can we solve this problem together? And what tools, what solutions can you provide? So yeah, I think it's a really hard framing, and it's something that I struggle with, and I think everyone naturally struggles with. But there's something incredibly powerful when you see that switch flick in our room, and all of a sudden people get excited. And that, I think, when you see people get excited and engaged, I think it means that something switched with them. They've been challenged, or they're all of a sudden getting these new ideas, and that's what I love to see, and that's kind of the sign that things are really working well.
Hey everybody, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode was awesome. I really enjoyed it. We're not specifically talking about environmental management, but we are talking about how we can figure out how to do environmental management better. And it's a whole conversation about the concept of dialogue in forest management, landscape management, wildfire mitigation, and how do we bring all of these perspectives and values together? How do we bring all these disciplines, right? All the people that have a say, all the recreation groups, all the industries, government, communities, indigenous communities, and universities, and all these people that have a say in how our values are managed. How do we bring them together to start to create this ultimate version of dynamic landscape planning, right? We know that in BC specifically, there's wildfires like crazy all the time, and it is having a huge impact on them economically, and as far as forest health, it is having impact on communities. And the problem is that wildfire management is no longer just a government problem, right? This is a whole of society problem, and we need whole of society solutions. That came from a dialogue that was hosted by the guest today. So the guest today is James Whitehead. He is a special projects manager with SFU Center for Dialogue. He's with the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative, and he's working on addressing the challenge of catastrophic wildfire in BC through the use of dialogue. So we dive into how do we get people to see eye to eye? How do we get these disciplines that may be seen to have cross purposes to understand where they can align and work together and maybe make big strides in the future of landscape planning? How do we set our ego aside at the door? And one quote that I want to say that James said at the end, that was fantastic. How do we disagree collaboratively? That is what this episode is about. And it was awesome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, James, for taking the time to do this. It was fantastic. I can't wait to share it. Sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one. They've been with me since the beginning. Can't do this without them. Thank you, West Fraser, for all of your support over the years. It's been fantastic. Love it. And also GreenLink Forestry has been with me since the beginning. Same thing. Couldn't do this without GreenLink. Nothing but supportive. Thank you, GreenLink. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation. We get into cool concepts like resilience. Like, what does resilience mean? What do we mean? Turns out that everybody has a different idea when they're talking about landscape resilience. What does that mean? We talk about dynamic landscape management. What does that mean? How do we know we're all talking about the same thing? If we're not talking about the same thing, how do we know the goalposts are in the right place, right? And just into the human nature of dialogue and what's needed to have successful dialogue. All right, here we go. Okay. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm excited to dive into this concept of just discussing dialogue, right? The idea of dialogue in landscape management, the idea of dialogue in collaboration, right? I think this day and age that we live in now, like it used to be, you get a job as a forester, you get a job as a conservation person, as a biologist, a fisheries person, and you could kind of stay in your lane. I feel like you could kind of just stay in your lane, focus on your job, and you get things done, right? The odd meeting with outside folks, but I feel like the problems and the issues, the things we're running up against now, they're all so transdisciplinary that like we have no choice but to constantly be in communication with all of the stakeholders all of the time. And I feel like our society and our industries we're still sorting that out, how that functions on a regular basis. So yeah, when I first heard your conversation, your dialogue, I should say, the workshop with AAFMP about functional dialogue and that kind of thing, I was really excited because I think this is something that I touch on a lot of episodes: is how do we collaborate, how do we communicate, how do we break through these barriers and understand each other's perspectives, right? So, yeah, I'm just excited to talk. So before we get into all that complexity and all that kind of stuff, I kind of want to get your background, your story. You know, what's your background? How did you get into this?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and yeah, excited to talk as someone that likes dialogue. So my background was kind of unintentional coming into this space. When I was in high school, we had a fire base nearby. The only rappel base in British Columbia was about 5 minutes from my house, and one year they came with a junior program to high school, and I went to a brief presentation, and after that I was just obsessed with this idea of firefighting. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grew up, so to speak, and I also didn't really know what I wanted to do to pay my way through university to kind of put together just over the next few years. And I got this idea of firefighting, and it just sort of controlled me for a couple of years. And I loved the idea. I loved the kind of adventure with it. I loved the idea, especially from the rappel base, of being able to fly all over the province and see these cool areas that very few people ever got to see. And so then I tried, and I failed 3 consecutive years to get into BC wildfire in various forms. And eventually, when I did, I got sent up to Vanderhoof to be on the Titan unit crew, which was about as far away from where I had intended to go as possible. And right. Was probably the best education I possibly could have got. So coming from Salmon Arm, and still a smaller town in BC, going to a much more remote rural town and being part of a unit crew. We went to major fires across British Columbia. So the unit crew, for those that don't know, is 20 people, and you travel to wherever the big fires are. You are who kind of work on the expanded incidents. So it really led me to kind of traveling all over BC, and I ended up spending 5 years on the Titan unit crew, with a couple intermissions where I went and did some work on initial attack, working on smaller fires around the province. But I really fell in love with kind of the big operational structure, the complexities of fighting fire, frankly, how dynamic the situation was with helicopters, air tankers, heavy equipment, controlled burns. So much of it was so exciting to someone in their young 20s, and basically gave me the summers to drive around and essentially be on a sports team and extend that part of my life for a bit longer. And you probably experienced something similar, I imagine, in your time.
Absolutely.
Fire, but yeah,
it was a good time.
I think the best days on that job are probably not days I'll ever match in other jobs, with how exciting and engaging and fulfilling they were.
Yeah.
About halfway through my time with BC Wildfire, and started crew leading, and through crew leading, it was a huge education, and I really started to gain an appreciation for the complexities of fire, and where as a firefighter on the ground, my job was very much to accomplish an operational objective, to do something. Whereas as a crew leader, I was often having to coordinate with other agencies. I was having to deal with public, occasionally media. And there were so many more complexities that came into the space as a crew leader, but also having to think about the different values. So if we do X, if we burn off a section, if we fall this tree, what are the consequences longer term for the forestry company, the licensee in this area, the homeowner, the landowner? And so all of a sudden it just kind of blew that world open, where It was a simple world where I had an objective and I did it. So all of a sudden there were these other ideas you need to account for and need to think about. And I think as you get more confident and comfortable, that really expands. And so about, I guess, coming into my 7th season, I realized that I wanted to sort of explore that a little bit more. And I wanted to also build a bit more of a sustainable lifestyle, which was a tough choice, but I decided to go to grad school, and I was kind of unsure what I wanted to study outside of I wanted it to be some sort of social science around wildfire. And that season, which was a 2021 fire season, I ended up working on this incredibly high-profile, complex fire where we had 40 to 50 residents that were staying behind and defying the evacuation orders.
Oh, wow.
And the first night that I was there, I was running a night shift on that fire with about 10 crew members. And the first night I was there, the landowner essentially told me to get lost. They didn't need help. They had been protecting their homes for the last week on their own. They hadn't had support, and they didn't need me now. And I was kind of taken aback, where every other situation we had largely been welcomed people that wanted us. And so over the course of a few days, I was able to build this relationship a little bit. It was still somewhat tense. And then on the 3rd or 4th night, we had a complete blow up, and this fire was coming towards an orchard. And I turn around the corner and there's 40 or 50 people fighting this fire, to the point of people riding in on quads, people in Tacomas with water buckets and hand pumps, and doing everything they can. And I was in the fortunate position where they were beside a big safety zone. They weren't at immediate physical risk, but it really kind of left me to the question after that fire is, what are the opportunities to engage that capacity in a safe way? Whereas if those people had been deep down on FSR, I would have been the person that had to send them all out, and I would have been the person that had to try and keep everyone safe. And it would have been a very hostile, very complex situation. Fortunately, there was a big safety zone nearby, and it was the best place for everyone to cluster and remain. Mm-hmm. But it was still a very complex or dynamic situation. And so it left me with the feeling that these people weren't going to leave. Like, they had been told to leave. They had been tried to push out. They had fire. They had equipment. They had some had experience. But everyone had a desire to help. And if these people weren't going to leave, what could we do to better engage them, to better bring them into the fold? Because the biggest thing for me as a crew leader in that situation was I didn't know where people were. I didn't know if they were safe. I didn't know if they were in risk. I didn't know if I could fall trees. I didn't know about using helicopters. And so it kind of handcuffs you in an operational perspective. But it also led me to this question, is like, these are genuinely valuable assets. They have equipment, they've got skills, and how can we engage them?
Yeah.
So that led me to do my master's, which was out of Prince George at UMBC. And I was working with Dr. Tristan Pierce. And in my master's, it really ended up focusing around community vulnerability. So in what ways are communities vulnerable to fire? And really looking beyond the risk to homes and the risk to properties, but looking at what ways the local economy is vulnerable to fire. If there's, say, a declining forest sector, does that increase or decrease the vulnerability? What about tourism, water bodies, that sort of thing? And so kind of taking a more holistic approach to vulnerability. And so in that work, I was working with the Robson Valley, so the communities of McBride, Tijon Cache, Dunster, Dome Creek, and just trying to understand the role of wildfire in those communities and how people responded and prepared for them. And so through that process, once again, it ended up unintentionally being built around this role of dialogue, where I was talking to people, trying to understand their concerns, their needs, their interests in fire. And at the conclusion of that process, I was just very fortunate, where the SFU Center for Dialogue was starting up a mitigating wildfire initiative. So the Center for Dialogue uses the tools of facilitation, engagement, dialogue to deal with complex or contentious issues in BC, and they happen to be starting up a fire project. And so I had the opportunity to come and work with these incredible facilitators and specialists in dialogue, where I could apply my sort of subject matter knowledge on fire to answer these questions, or to try and address these questions that I was really, really passionate about. So broadly, that's how I've come to this space. And it's really sort of the culmination of 2 or 3 different experiences that have all kind of built up into that.
Yeah. That's fascinating, because I think anybody in the landscape management, kind of forestry or conservation, wildfire space has been told or made aware of situations like that, where like in this era of just very severe, out of control wildfires, where there's just a lot of people who, yeah, like you said, you want to mobilize those extra assets that are on the ground that you have no way of mobilizing, right? How do you get these people who, yeah, they might have a dugout in their back with a pump and the tools to do it, but they have no way of getting people to help them or whatever. And there's this massive workforce that wants to help. And like you said, you're coming in as a government agency and trying to control it. And now you've got more risk added towards what you have to deal with. And it's this complicated space where there's so much opportunity, also a lot of risk. And like, yeah, we need to sort this out, which is, I think, it's a very modern problem, I feel like, in this area, right? But it's fascinating. I think I can appreciate that concept and the importance of it, right? I think so. We've already spoke about dialogue quite a bit already, the concept of dialogue. I want to, before we dive into anything further, let's define that concept of dialogue, because I think up until a few years ago, I didn't really understand what that meant. I was like, oh yeah, these people are going to have a conversation and like sort some stuff out. But it's deeper than that. It's more complex, or it's more wholesome even than that, having a dialogue, right? So can I get you to explain the definition of a dialogue, what it is to you, and why that word in particular is what we're looking for?
Yeah, I'll confess that after a year and a half in this space, like explicitly, I work for the Center for Dialogue. I don't have a fully clear answer to that. I think there's a few key points that I would give.
Yeah, let's wax poetic about it then.
I think dialogue is a tool where we're really looking to sort of bring different voices into the room. And I know that that's easily said and much harder to be done, but when we talk about bringing different voices into the room, it's not simply checking boxes for representation as to who's there, but making sure that those voices are, I think, heard and listened to, and really engaged with. So I really take it as is kind of going beyond just listening to what other people are saying, but making sure these diverse perspectives and diverse opinions are actually really engaged with and wrestled with and considered. And so that's a major point of dialogue for me. The second piece is, I think it has to be a really safe conversation. We do a lot of our dialogues under what's known as the Chatham House Rule, which means that what is said in the dialogue is allowed to be shared and allowed to be shared out and attributed to that dialogue in general. But who attends and who says what is not allowed to be shared. So if we're in one of these conversations and you say something, I can repeat that comment, but I can't attribute it to you. And what that really allows is a way for people to sort of take off their hats of their job or their representation. So one group that really tends to like that is government representatives, where they're allowed to all of a sudden be recognized as true experts in their field in a way that they often can't when they're speaking to the constraints and speaking to the challenges that they face in their job. And so really allowing people to engage in the way that they can. And I think that's a huge part of successful dialogue. And third, I think, is it has to be very intentional. So we often talk about bringing people together to have conversations. And I think that's such an important skill, but it often doesn't go that far. A dialogue, when the way that we frame it, is really focused around answering a couple key questions. And it's probably not going to give you a full answer to all of them, because there isn't a clear one answer, but it's really focused around a key targeted question that I think is pretty crucial to having an effective dialogue, so to speak, is that intentionality and that target. Because so many times, I think, especially with fields of forestry or fire or land management, these fields are so complex and everyone has different, I think, hobby horses or different areas of focus within them. And I see so many conversations that are really authentic, really, really open, really honest, that just don't go anywhere because there isn't that framework, that structure, that coordination. And so we really aim to be a very targeted conversation that people can come to openly and safely. and they will have to hear challenging and different and complex perspectives, but it'll be under a structure or under a framework. And so I think there's a level of intentionality there that is really our primary asset, where we can provide the safe environment, but really provide guardrails to that conversation to keep it on track.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating that the concept of like your first point, listening, right? It's fascinating that you can have a room full of people and everyone's hearing, right? They're hearing. I heard what you said, but no one's listening, right? No one's really taking it in, absorbing it, reflecting on it, and accepting the fact that someone might have a different perspective to them that might be equally or more relevant than your own perspective, right? I feel like that simple, like it could be, like you said, it's so simply, right? Like, I just want people to listen and respect what other people say and actually reflect on it. But that is a whole thing in and of itself to get a group of people, stakeholders, let's call them stakeholders for lack of a better word, right? A bunch of different people from different backgrounds, different cultures come together to try and have a conversation about wildfire mitigation. And you have to get everybody to get along and to respect and to reflect. Like, that in and of itself in a professional setting is a huge, like, that's, to be able to do that, to accomplish that successfully is impressive, because to get people to put their ego aside and to just be a person that can listen and respond and have a reasonable dialogue is so challenging. But also, if you can get it to happen, so fulfilling. It seems like you really everybody starts to grow and learn and get places that you would never have gotten to on your own.
I think that, if I'm being brutally honest, that's the part of this job that I struggle with the most. Is I think having a lot of subject matter, like interest in the subject matter and experience in the subject matter, is how hard it is to come to a conversation and not just listen to someone's perspective, but to actually hear it and to grapple with it and to engage with it. And so I'm a year and a half into this space, and I noticed that in myself. And so we bring people in for a day or two, and we're asking them to kind of switch into that mode. And it's really hard. It's I have a huge amount of respect for people that really come to these events willing to grapple with other people's perspectives and challenging ideas. And not everyone is able to do that to the same level, but I think it's so environmental. Once that is demonstrated by a leader in the group, often it's so-called status or when people come in, but once that's demonstrated by a leader in the group, it kind of gives permission for everyone else to kind of break down or ask those questions, to really push themselves. And I think naturally, as professionals, we come into a space, we want to look polished and professional and like we know what we're talking about. Yeah. And fundamentally, as a dialogue, we're asking people to kind of put that aside and to grapple with a hard issue together. And really the framing is not what can you get for your organization out of this conversation, but can we solve this problem together? And what tools, what solutions can you provide?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it's a really hard framing, and it's something that I struggle with, and I think everyone naturally struggles with. But there's something incredibly powerful when you see that switch flick in our room, and all of a sudden people get excited. And that, I think, when you see people get excited and engaged, I think it means that something switched with them. They've been challenged, or they're all of a sudden getting these new ideas, and that's what I love to see, and that's kind of the sign that things are really working well.
Totally. Isn't that a magical thing? Like I can almost equate it to when you're in school and the teacher, the professor asks a question and it's just quiet, right? And everybody's got a thought about it, but nobody wants to speak up because nobody wants to bring up their inadequacies or bring up what they might not know or be wrong. And it's that fear of being wrong or saying something wrong or saying something offensive that keeps us from doing that. And when you go to a professional setting, I feel like it's only more amplified, right? Because, I'm a professional, I'm an expert, I'm a knowledge holder, I know, and so it's almost like if we can just give people the space to just say whatever. Like let's explore some stuff. Just say what comes to your mind. We're not going to hold you accountable. Let's just see where this goes. And it's so hard to get everybody to check the ego at the door and to check their worry at the door because they have legitimate worries, legitimate concerns about, how they might be portrayed or how they might be treated. But it's, if you can do it, and all of a sudden it creates this freedom of speech, like true freedom of speech without consequence. It's, like you said, I think it's magical, right? Like it's just this, all of a sudden we're actually people seeing eye to eye, talking one to one. We might not agree, but like we can not agree and still move forward, which is fascinating. And I've only been a part of like maybe one thing like that, and it was amazing.
I think the one piece that really like always strikes me as kind of an inflection point is for anyone that ever comes to one of our dialogues, within probably half an hour, you'll be asked to do something that's probably pretty uncomfortable for you. And it's generally an arts-based activity. And I am the least artistic person on the planet. Or at least I thought so until we started this. And the level of sort of discomfort and awkwardness around it is fascinating to watch. And I fully see myself in that. But I think even just that first step, you kind of break down that initial discomfort where you sort of have to engage in something you're not comfortable on.
Yeah.
And if everyone's doing it, it's a safe environment. It's kind of like, I've heard an analogy of skinny dipping. Like if you're doing it on your own, it's never going to go well. But once you have 2 or 3 people and there's a critical mass, then it's easy to join and easy to partake in.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, it's a group thing, right? As soon as everyone's doing it, then nobody's vulnerable anymore because everybody's on the same page. Yeah, and that I feel like that Chatham House rule probably makes a big difference, right? Being able to check your job at the door and just be a professional that doesn't have responsibilities, and like I guess not even be a professional, be an intellectual in that moment, right?
And I think, especially for some people, they're so tied to the work that they do, where if you are someone that works for government, you have a very distinct set of responsibilities and things you can speak to. But what often isn't recognized is that people that have been in government for 15, 20 years working on these same topics are like leading experts in this space, and they don't often get the sort of recognition for that. And this is an opportunity to really engage in a more open way.
Yep, absolutely. It's interesting when in those moments in life when you can take yourself out of the shoes you normally live in and be someone else for a moment, and you're just like, oh, this is nice. Why can't I do this more often? It's hard to do, right? Take yourself out of your own perspective, but when you can do that, it's so much richer. I was really intrigued when I heard about the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, and I was like, what is that, right? Like and then you're the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative and the stuff that's going on there that you guys are working on. It's something that's so needed this day and age, right? To try and convince and to try and get a successful dialogue going. So you've been a part of 2 now, correct?
We actually just did a 3rd recently.
A 3rd. Okay, so you've done 3 now. And how have these first of all, I guess, let's talk about who's all there, who's all represented, and then how did you see these dialogues going?
So, I guess to start, as a result of the Chatham House rule, I can't give names, but broadly, the people that are typically in these rooms, they change dialogue to dialogue. And as an organization, we've done a couple more. So it really varies. I guess one which is a little bit different that we've done has been a tier 1 or Indigenous only dialogue focused on Indigenous fire stewardship. And that is basically various experts or representatives of different First Nations that got into a room. They recognized the need to have a Indigenous only dialogue that was facilitated by an Indigenous facilitator. We simply provided the secretariat or the back end support there. And so that's a little bit different. But for the other dialogues that we've been a part of, it's a really diverse group. So we have provincial representation. Like obviously the province is a land manager in British Columbia for the most part, and they're really interested in having these conversations, but also a really crucial part of them. Alongside that, local nations. We always make sure that there's representatives from local nations, because the work that we're doing really, really affects the work of these nations and with their land management and reconciliation work. And so those are really the kind of clear-cut experts. Big one though is local foresters, like the forest companies in BC, the tenure holders, the licensees. They are a crucial part of this conversation. They are how land management objectives get accomplished in our current regime or current framework. And So some of the forest sector, and that also includes community forests or woodlots in various areas, but it can be more diverse than that. So often it's contractors or consultants that work in the space, experts from various universities on fire or forestry. And then sometimes it's a little bit more out there. So in some dialogues, we've had nurses talking about the effects of smoke on their work. And
of course,
it was really, really fascinating where just one small anecdote, that's a different perspective that we don't often speak about in fire. And the nurse in this one case provided this excellent framing of, say, prescribed fire as a harm reduction approach in the same way we talk about harm reduction from the medical perspective. And that's a framing and a perspective that we would never have got within the fire space specifically. And so I really enjoy when we can bring someone that's kind of out of left field into these conversations.
Oh yeah. Mix it up, stir the pot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then beyond that, it's local fire departments. It's basically, we try, if we're doing a locally focused dialogue, to have everyone that plays an ongoing or active role in the space, but also people that might play a role going forward. So sometimes we'll have local funders there. Sometimes we'll have land managers for other jurisdictions that are starting to come into the fold. So it's pretty broad, and I don't really have there isn't really a set answer, but it's very dialogue to dialogue dependent. So,
sure.
For instance, I'm doing work right now on one on more general around fire in the forest sector in BC. And so this one's much more forestry heavy. So I'm looking at foresters from the major licensees. I'm looking at different forestry associations, looking at obviously provincial employees and wildfire experts. So that one will be much less locally focused and kind of a broader pool provincially. Whether a locally oriented dialogue will be much more centered in and around one place.
Right. Yeah. No. And that totally makes sense. So the unfortunately, I didn't get the most recent dialogue report, so I didn't get to go through that, but we can get into it. I do want to get into the mitigating wildfire initiative report, the one on resilience that you guys focused on, because I found that concept as a dive into dialogue a really interesting way to dive into it, because we talk about wildfire resilience all the time, right? Or landscape resilience, right? And we all have this concept in our mind of what that means. So what does it mean to have a resilient landscape, resilience against wildfire, or whatever that might be? And you guys held this dialogue where you started off, I believe, by defining what everyone thought of as resilience. Is that correct?
Yeah, we basically we do pre-interviews typically before our workshops. So we talk to everyone for about half an hour coming in. And we asked everyone what resilience was, and it was fascinating. Like, resilience is kind of a term for generic good that means so many different things to so many different people. And I think that really devalues it at times when it's such a powerful concept.
Yeah.
So we would have, to generalize, it was largely foresters and ecologists and biologists would talk about resilience being the ability from an ecosystem to bounce back after a disturbance, which is your textbook definition. And then we'd talk to a local mill owner who would talk about resilience as the ability for me to support my family, or we would speak to a local First Nation, and they would talk about resilience is the ability for my family to harvest food in 7 generations. And thought that these are incompatible, but so many people had different perspectives as to what resilience was, that we really wanted to unpack what value this concept had and what use it has in land planning. And so we end up framing a dialogue around this, and it was kind of aligned with changes to BC's land management process, where we're now starting to see forest landscape plans, which are going to really change the way in which forests are managed, where the government's now taking on a bit more of a role in sort of that mid-level management, rather than simply leaving that to licensees and industry, and trying to really accommodate for multiple values in that space. And I think resilience is such I struggle to say an overused term, but maybe a misunderstood or an underclarified term, because it's so crucial to these conversations, but it's so often used cross purposes, and people don't understand that each other are using it cross purposes.
Yes.
So I'm going to be frustrated and suggest that I don't have a true, clear definition for resilience after, but I think I've hopefully can complicate the question of resilience and what it means at different scales and to different people and to different groups.
Totally. No, and that makes total sense, because like when I think about what I think of, I should say, as landscape resilience, it's the ability to have the whole suite of values across the landscape at all times, regardless of the dynamic nature of the landscape, right? So that everything can be represented, everything is healthy, nothing is at risk of being lost because of one big wildfire, right? But when I was listening to the recording with AAFMP regarding, this conversation that you guys had, this dialogue you guys held, all of a sudden I was like, oh, right, there is going to be a million ways that people think about resilience, because it's one of, like you said, it's one of those words that's everywhere. Every report you read is talking about we need to maximize resilience, landscape resilience, wildfire resilience, or whatever. And you're like, yeah, okay, gotcha. And you know what that means to you, and that's about it. So, which I just found that such a fascinating step into the importance of real, true dialogue and transdisciplinary communication, right? In a real, ongoing, never-ending way, because it's just like if you could be saying the same words and you could mean something totally different. So how are you ever going to have the same goalposts for what success looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that really jumped out to me was the willingness of the forestry community to think deeply about social resilience in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. And I think it really jumped out to me as to how many foresters are having to wrap their heads around essentially being social scientists in their work. Yeah. And so when that kind of social definition of resilience was put forward, and I think to the real credit of some of the local First Nations, the forestry community was fascinated by how to kind of engage this. And I think that's the piece that really jumped out to me, is from those sort of ecologically minded people, a realization that ecological only definitions are no longer serving the purpose, and a deep desire to kind of clarify their social work and their understanding of the social dynamics at play.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's more and more of the conversations that are being had, right? Like, is that anybody in the landscape management role has to have all of these hats. And yeah, we all went to school because we liked trees and wanted to be left alone. And then we got put into this place where like, hey, by the way, you have to talk to people all the time. You're like, oh no, what's going on? Yeah. And it's interesting to note that there, up until very recently, that is not a skill set that was pushed on the landscape management forestry community, right? So it's a very new thing that there's no practice in, and we need to get on that, right? So it's happening now, but the broader industry at large and the other communities at large are they're not well practiced. They may be aware of this concept, but yeah, they're not well practiced at it. But it's absolutely true. I think we got to get comfortable with this idea of talking all the time and just getting those perspectives out there. Did you find when you're sitting there listening to everyone talk about their definition of resilience, I think it's important to ask the question of whether or not you found them to be kind of strictly any of them at cross purposes, or was it more complicated than that? Do you think it was just kind of different perspectives that all kind of came together as a whole weave of potentially doable and accomplishable goals from everybody's perspective?
I don't think I saw any that were explicitly cross purpose.
Right. Like obviously we'll have differences, very big differences, but like, can we work together to accomplish whatever? Right. Yeah.
I think the big question the big fundamental theme around all of our work in wildfire that really stands out to me is wildfire is a question of trade-offs in terms of what level of trade-off are we willing to do to sacrifice the quote unquote integrity of our forests as they are. What trade-offs are we willing to accept in terms of fire on the landscape, in terms of costs? And when we spoke about different definitions of resilience, I think that question of trade-offs comes up so much, where from conservation groups and leaders that were in that space, their definition of resilience was a resilient ecosystem that wildlife could thrive in and wildlife could operate in. And then there were some remote and rural and largely indigenous communities that talked about fire as this existential crisis where it threatened the very existence of their community. And some of the restrictions that they were facing were a result of conservation initiatives. And so I wouldn't say there was explicit cross-purpose definition from a definition perspective, but I do think there is deep conflict in the trade-offs of some of those definitions.
That checks out.
Especially from an applied on-the-ground sense. So from a short conversation on resilience, they all seem remarkably compatible, but when you actually get into the nitty-gritty, that's where there's real conflict. And some of them were, I think, at the very least, very implicitly cross purposes because they were talking about a local situation, local places on the ground. And so that's really where it gets messy, is actually unpacking what all sound like very laudable, fantastic, like deeply reasonable things to pursue, unpacking what those look like when we think about where on the land basis this can happen, how it gets applied. And that's where it gets a lot messier.
That makes sense. So as a concept, the concepts are not necessarily cross-purpose, but when you start talking about very specific localities, those now all of a sudden, there's conflict because you got 5 different perspectives that want different things. And you're like, okay, well, in this specific locality, we can't do all of them, right? We have to, I get that. That makes sense. I think
it's very hard to argue against anyone's definition of resilience.
Right.
As not being logical or reasonable. No one's likely to argue against resilience as habitat for all species. And no one's going to argue against resilience as the ability for a forest to withstand a disturbance. But when you're talking about a specific stand or a specific community, these concepts get much more messy.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah. Do you see, we hear a lot in these kind of reports and deep research that, there's a need for like a paradigm shift, right? That word paradigm shift is so heavily used. I think it's as well used as resilience is, right? And we all I think everyone kind of understands more or less what that might mean. And just like at the very broad scale, it's just we need a big change. We need a big change in how we do things. When we talk about a paradigm shift in, say, like wildfire management, do you think we need that? Is a paradigm shift needed, or is it just like, from what I'm hearing from you, is that it's not necessarily a paradigm shift, more communication, more understanding, more preemptive, and less reactionary approaches to wildfire management? Maybe, I don't know.
I think, in many senses, yes, you probably could call it a paradigm shift. I'm not going to get too into the specifics of what that entails, but I think when I think of wildfire, I really think of it as deeply tied and deeply linked to all of these other questions of land management, how we live on the land, how we think about natural hazards and climate change. And in a lot of these areas, we do need I think we would probably a pretty clear need for some sort of paradigm shift. So when I think about wildfire, I think about a fundamental shift in the way we consider wildfire, and we understand wildfire, and we live with the outcomes or the consequences of being in a fire-prone region. So I do think there's a paradigm shift in our perspective and the way we consider fire, which is definitely happening. You see it rapidly where we're now in the last couple of years, fire is very much spoken of as kind of an inevitability, and sometimes a little bit of a doomeristic way, but that's definitely a shift that's in progress. I struggle to be prescriptive in my role, where I don't think I'm necessarily the person to give all the answers at this point. As a lot of our role is considering different viewpoints and perspectives, but I do think I would probably trend towards the need for a paradigm shift. They're largely in reconsidering the way that we live on the land and the natural forces that are affecting us. And then I think when we go into a little bit more into the forestry space, I think there's a really interesting question where we see a misalignment about how much of the province thinks about, and I think probably the country thinks about our forest from a values perspective. Like what values do we get out of the recreation, the clean air we breathe, the aesthetics that we see, and much of the land managers are thinking of it from a economic perspective by necessity.
Yep.
If you
Right.
are,
That's the job.
if you're a forest company, you're
Mhm.
in a brutal, challenging industry right now that is hanging on for dear life, and there are those economic realities. So I think I really deeply see a need for a paradigm shift in the way that we talk about our forest management, because it's such a misalignment with how it's legislated and governed versus the realities on the ground. But and I think that fits kind of into that fire question. So it's probably a messy, convoluted answer to your question there. But
this is a messy, convoluted conversation, right? Like it's. I think what would have been a better question for me to ask, as I was reflecting on what you were saying, a better question for me to ask would have been, did all the people, all the representatives, all the angles, all the perspectives from these dialogues, does everybody agree that a shift is needed, that we need to change something? Okay, that's a better question, because I feel like that's more definitive, and we're like, okay, yes, everybody agrees that something needs to change, and I think that's an important thing to point out.
I think absolutely. I would just highlight two things. One is the main dialogue that we're talking about occurred in Williams Lake, which in 2017 was a huge threat, and a very huge portion of the caribou land base was burnt. And then these are also people that self-select to take 2 to 3 days of their time to come and answer a cold email that from a group they've never heard of, and sit and talk about wildfire. So I think there's selection bias there, but broadly out of land management professionals that we talk to, almost everyone sees a need to try and at least work and wrap our heads around the scale of this wildfire challenge.
Yeah. What do you think is holding us back from that shift then? From your perspective of you're in your unique perspective that you've been in a lot of these dialogues and you've seen kind of how the flow of the conversation, right? So like, what is the holdup?
Yeah, I think the holdup is in a couple key areas. One is the application. Like, if we have to talk about a desired end state, which is something like a BC that recognizes fire as a normal part of the landscape and has worked to address our fire hazard in a way that's resilient and respects ecological integrity and stuff, like, you can probably get everyone on board for that end vision. And it's not to diminish it at all, but the conflict really lies in the application as to what does it look like. And we've seen like some research now is suggesting that up to 40% of our forests might have to be not conducive to carrying high intensity wildfire to really disrupt the risk of catastrophic wildfire that we see throughout much of BC. And like, that requires massive trade-offs. And no one comes out of that happy when we're talking about fundamentally changing the way we consider up to 40% of our land. That's a really, really tough conversation. So the piece that I see is a need to wrap our head around the scale of the problem, the scale of the challenge. A need to really understand the consequences of what we're talking about, where that end goal is the same, but the applications are really, really challenging. And then the other piece, which might be a little bit less intuitive, is I think we really need to figure out the economic question. Right now, it's often really kind of marginalized or sidelined because there's so much conflict around forestry versus conservation, so much conflict around the way that fires are suppressed. But I think there's a huge barrier and a lack of understanding as to the scale of the economic challenge. Like, this work to kind of restore our forest to some sort of natural fire regime is astronomically expensive. And when I speak about astronomically expensive, I'm talking about to the extent of our total provincial budget for all education, healthcare, everything. And so when we're talking about that kind of cost, it's not going to happen through strictly government funding. And I think there's a real question there about figuring out the economics behind this as well. So that's the third transformation, or the third piece that I would really, really give that's kind of missing, or a real challenge that we're running into.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's these problems are so big that I do feel like sometimes this might be not fair, but I'm going to say it anyways because I can do that. I feel like with these big landscape problems, these issues that we run into, you can kind of, the responsibility can kind of get lost in the complexity. You know what I mean? So there's a bit of like, okay, I'm X person. I'm part of the landscape management community in one way or another. I have a certain amount of responsibility, but you can kind of pass it off to the next person, or you can kind of, in your own mind, right? You can kind of think, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything just yet because we're still sorting it out, right? I feel like there's kind of a diffusion of responsibility where that maybe that diffusion of responsibility has taken the pressure off all the individuals as a whole, and that has kind of slowed maybe the immediacy needed to tackle this issue, right? Because I think everyone recognizes the need. Everyone knows, hey, we need to do this now, because every year we're getting nailed by these huge wildfires that are destroying huge swaths of landscape, communities, and everything. And we know we need to do something, but we don't know what. And I feel like from the outside looking in, it seems like there's just no real central, not command post, but like a central location where like all these decisions can be made in real time and actually, you know what I'm trying to get at? Like there's just this diffusion of responsibility that seems to halt progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you go to anyone in the forestry space right now, they're all deeply concerned about fire, whether that's
of course.
Whether that's Indigenous governance and Indigenous owned forestry companies, whether that's your major licensees, whether that's the provincial government. Fire is a major issue for everyone, but there isn't, like you say, that centralized coordination point. And that's without something like that, and without that kind of centralized structure, everyone can only operate as to the incentives they have, which is not
exactly
not a systemic solution.
Yeah.
And so
what do we do?
One of the areas we're hoping to work on is to really start building out some sort of wildfire network. And the federal government, through Natural Resources Canada, has recently put out a call for what they call a Center for Excellence. And this is essentially meant to be some sort of central research and information and networking group that will hopefully kind of coordinate this work across Canada and probably kind of broken down into provincial or ecosystem type scales. And so this hasn't been announced yet as to who was awarded this, but I know there was quite a bit of interest from across the country. So my hope is that there really be a bit of progress as to that, kind of in that direction over the next few years. But I think that's such a huge barrier, that coordination point. And in BC, we're starting, for my group, the Centre for Dialogue, with Dr. Robin Freeman, who's my colleague, is starting to work on kind of a BC network, and whether that fits into the federal network or not, we'll see. But she's really looking to take the lead as to how wildfire networks between different players in British Columbia can help. And I think even to the level of how information is shared is such a barrier right now. I can name 2 to 3 other groups doing similar work to us that are releasing reports, and they just don't really get seen outside of informal networks, through social media, through LinkedIn, through the odd people that still check a website on a regular basis. And I think there's a real opportunity to be that central connective point where we can share work from across BC for other practitioners in BC, but also share, if dialogue is working in BC, share that to your fire practitioners and your leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and so on and so forth. And so I think that network piece is really good from an information perspective. And then I think it gets more tricky from a coordination perspective, but I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited to see that, because I feel like for like a decade now, it's been this conversation about like, hey, we need a coordination point. And it's like, okay, hopefully this Center for Excellence is what we've been waiting for, because we just need some structure to help us define this. And it can't be the government, because they're one of these people. They can be a part of it, but it can't be that, right? Yeah. So that's fascinating. I love that idea. Just the coordination of it, because then all of a sudden you have just a central intelligence almost, right? Where the hive mind can come together and make these landscape decisions, and or even that can help filter down into the locality as well, right? And like, okay, we'll have some kind of decision matrix on how we can break this down based off local values, right? So I love that idea. It's much needed for sure. Yeah, one of the quotes I got from, I'm not sure who said it, but it was in that report, the dialogue on strategic and collaborative approaches to mitigating wildfire. One of the dialogues you had, one of the quotes was, "Fire is no longer just a government issue. Fire is a whole of society problem and will need a whole of society solution." I feel like that quote encapsulates the whole conversation, right? There's been a lot of focus on, okay, the government's responsible for wildfire, or the forest management company is responsible for whatever. But this is a whole society thing, right? Like there's so many different values at play. And I feel like that encapsulates this whole conversation so well. And the need for, like you said, a center for excellence. That sounds great.
Yeah. The all of society approaches, we're starting to see that language used a lot. And to the credit of the federal government, they've really taken the leadership on that. But I think there really is this realization that it's affecting so many different places, people, organizations, values around the province. As you say, it's really expanding beyond the scope of what a single government can do to address it. Like it's not increasing the suppression budgets incrementally as to do the work that needs to be done. I think as we saw over the last few weeks in California, like that's probably the best prepared urban area on the planet for wildfires. And when we get the conditions that we're getting, no amount of firefighters or fire trucks or helicopters or planes is going to do what needs to be done. And the solution really sits in that mitigation perspective, that mitigation place, and that bringing everyone together. And I think the other piece too that I would add is the impacts of fire are all of society. Like in 2023, we saw 1 in 200 Canadians evacuated from their homes. The impacts of the Los Angeles fires, that will affect our car insurance in BC and Alberta through reinsurance. That has systemic risk on our financial markets, how people's ability to rebuild, people's ability to get insurance and to sell their homes. And so the consequences of wildfire, I think, are starting to be financialized in a way that really, really affects everyone. And then on top of that, we also get into health risks to our local tourism industries and ecological values. So all of society in a very scary way, I think is a very true statement about the impacts of fire, but also in the solutions. Like it's on homeowners to prepare their homes for fires. It's on small communities to prepare for these events. And it is on all of us to really push for this as being a value that we've, like one of our values on the landscape that we vote for, that we push for politically. So, I think all of society is over and over again becoming kind of the mantra around wildfire, or the description of its impacts as well as potential solutions.
Yeah, we need a new stat holiday, National Wildfire Preparedness Day, where work stops, everybody has to do wildfire mitigation stuff. You got to fire smart your home, you got to do whatever. It's stat holiday. Come on, federal government, figure it out. Just kidding.
Always supportive of that.
Yeah, right. So I want to ask you about, like, all this experience that you've had facilitating these dialogues. How has that informed your expectations of what you can reasonably expect to get from, that transdisciplinary collaboration?
Yeah, I think when I first saw dialogue, from that dialogue you just quoted, that was my second week on the job.
Nice.
And I left that dialogue with kind of the impression that this is it. This is going to change everything. And since then, I would say my expectations have been tempered a little bit. I see dialogue as a tool. Dialogue's a really, really important tool to get people on the same page and to deal with the inevitable conflicts and disagreements, as well as some of the challenges we face. But I think dialogue is a tool in the toolkit, and it's fantastic at highlighting issues, and not just from a general standpoint. You can get deeply, deeply specific on mechanistic challenges that people are facing through dialogue.
For sure, of course.
But I don't think it's going to solve absolutely everything on its own. I think dialogue paired with like research and innovation and figuring out, like, if we're looking to figure out the business model for forestry, I don't think that's going to come from a pure dialogic place. That might be implemented through dialogue, and it might be identified through dialogue, but there has to be this work going on independently. So I look at it as a really powerful tool that can really help our understanding of problems and adoption of solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But from an innovation space, it's a tool in the toolkit.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. Yeah, and I keep coming back in my own mind to this concept of listening, right? And I guess it can be more aptly explained as empathy, really. Like really the need for the professional and knowledge holder space, everyone that's involved in making these decisions or having this dialogue around mitigating wildfire, their ability to, like we said earlier, about step out of their own shoes, step into somebody else's, and really consider what it would be like to be in their situation and how important that would be and how that would affect their life. And then step back into your own shoes and go, okay, how can I become more comprehensive? How can I become more empathetic? How can I start to include those values as my own to try and be a better land manager or whatever, right? Like, I think that's a human problem, right? That's really a human problem, not a professional problem. But how do you think we can encourage and promote empathy and true listening in order to develop these bigger ideas that require more than one mind or one profession or one, knowledge system that requires everybody to come together to work together? But we need, if we can't do that, then dialogue fails, right? We need that empathy to make this happen. And I'm sure that is, like you said before, that's probably a huge issue, right? Is people have a hard time setting their ego aside. I feel like that's almost the big problem of our time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is how do we just set that aside and be empathetic and really try to find the solution that helps everybody?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, or probably multi-billion-dollar question at this point. But really, I think so much of it comes into first conversations. I think in our world today, we struggle to have conversations with people that we don't agree with. And a lot of the time we stick in our tribes, whether it's industry, whether it's education level, whether that's age. We tend to be very segmented across society. And I think it's really, really been fascinating through the question of dialogue to have these conversations that bring together groups from so many different places and backgrounds. And one area where I would still say we really struggle to bring people in is youth and younger people into this space. The role of dialogue in really understanding and engaging with other people's perspectives, I think, has been kind of transformative in some situations. But where I struggle is how we are not going to be able to connect with everyone through a two-day workshop that has 25 to 35 people. How we really expand that outward and how we really expand that to a broader community. And I think about a lot of the conflicts that we've seen around forestry in British Columbia, where it really kind of catches fire in the social fabric or social context of the province. And it gets very messy. So I don't have a clear answer, but I think the biggest piece that comes up over and over again is just having conversations with people that are of a different value set or of a different mindset, and building those relationships and learning how to disagree in a collaborative way. And it's such a challenging thing to do. And we're really, really curious. I'm really curious as I go further with this Dialogic project is to explore how do we bring that to a broader community? Or is it the correct avenue for change to a policy lens? And it's probably a bit of both, but I think your question there is a really, really crucial one, and one that kind of a small, high impact in-person dialogue is probably not super well equipped to answer.
No, for sure. You know what? I really want to highlight a short phrase that you just said, because I think it encapsulates the whole thing, is learning how to disagree collaboratively. I love that. That's great. I don't know if that came out of something or where that's from, but that's the perfect way to say it. You're like, I want you to be able to disagree and still respect each other and move forward, right? And still and come up with different solutions that maybe you can recognize that you disagree and you're not going to see eye to eye, but how do we move together in the right direction, right? I think that's fascinating. I like that.
I think that framing actually comes from other articles and podcasts I've been reading lately on sort of the impact of loneliness in society, and that's taking it a slightly different direction. But there was recently a brilliant article in The Atlantic written by a guy called Derek Thompson, and his big thesis was we're spending much less time with people, but we aren't necessarily more lonely. And so we're spending more time with the people that are really close to us, more time with sort of our tribe or community or our fandoms, but less time with those neighbors or people you would interact with at the bar or soccer practice or any other public venue. And he would say his thesis was really that kind of missing middle there is why we're so bad at disagreeing now, is because we aren't exposed to people in person with different political opinions outside of Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. And that really resonated with me in the work that we do, where it's kind of our goal is to sort of rebuild some of those relationships. Obviously it's a bit more targeted, but I think we used to be a lot better at disagreeing because we dealt with people with different opinions a lot more in the past.
But it's so comfortable to sit with the people that I agree with and talk about how we agree with each other. It's so nice. We just sit there and talk about, you're right, we got to figure it out. This is what we should do. It's this now. We know everything. We include society. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. That totally, I could see that being true, right? It's gotten so easy to create our own cliques, to create our own tribe, and just stay within that. And whenever you step out, you go, I can't believe what this person said. That's ridiculous.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's something that's what I've loved about this job, is being able to explore that a little bit more. And it's a bit of my hobby horse at the moment outside of work too, but I think it's a really fascinating framing. And yeah, and I think that's one of the real benefits of dialogue, is we do put people in a room together that have entirely different backgrounds and jobs and political identities.
Yeah. Force them to figure it out. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. What a challenge, right? Like it almost seems at a very simplistic level, my mind goes towards, there needs to be a lot of like mandatory continued competence in certain professions for, okay, you need to do 10 hours a year of contemplative practice, right? And then some kind of like mindfulness course, some kind of, or maybe it's a course completely outside of your realm of study, right? Something you know nothing about, but you could follow along well enough, and maybe we'll have very different perspectives on. And just like, you almost need to force people into situations where they're forced to deal with conflicting views and understand that they're not the professional in that room, right? And to see how they cope with that. I don't know. Like, I'm just going off the cuff here, but that's interesting. I don't know how you solve that solution or solve that problem.
Yeah, no, I quite like that idea, and I think there's a huge value to being bad at things, or less good at things, or less optimized at things than we are. And yeah, I don't have a good answer there, but I really see dialogue as part of that. But it's much harder to do when we talk about multiplying that across 5 million people in British Columbia or 40 million people across Canada.
Totally. Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, it's a huge issue, but I think just getting people to talk about it and start to recognize these issues is, I guess that's the first step, right? And moving in the right direction, and hopefully it starts to pick up steam here, right? Hopefully we start to get some real movement and some real I don't know what that looks like, but I guess that's a question in and of itself. We talk a lot about moving towards dynamic landscapes, right? That idea of a dynamic landscape is, again, it's probably one of those ones just like resilience, right? Like, you could have a whole dialogue with everybody. What do you think dynamic landscape planning or dynamic landscape management will look like, right? And everybody's going to have different ideas, and it's going to be just this hodgepodge of perspectives and ideas. And like, but I kind of want to ask you, seeing as you've been this moderator in these spaces, what's your imagination tell you about the future idea of dynamic landscape planning? Like, what does that look like in your mind?
So, from kind of unburdened by reality, I think the piece that really jumps out to me is a quote by Dr. Paul Hesburgh, who's a fire scientist out of Wenatchee, Washington, and he really talks about the need for your land management plans to be 10 pages, not 1,000, where so much of it is around a vision or a kind of a general concept or a goal. and we entrust experts and competent people to make those decisions. And I recognize that that's a really tough sell in our bureaucratic reality right now. But I think in terms of being dynamic and responsive to situations, it's very, very difficult too with how structured a lot of our institutions are. And so
policy is just like, it holds you to a standard that you can't step outside of. The policy itself is a structure that's impossible to fight against. Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really, really good reasons for policy and a lot of places where it's very much needed. But I think when we speak about adaptive or dynamic land management, our policy is uniquely challenged in addressing that because it's so structured. And in British Columbia, I think a lot of the work that we've done has been very, very good at accomplishing certain policy objectives. But I think we're now grappling with these sort of undercurrents that we weren't necessarily aware of. Things like reconciliation. That's been a fundamental shift in the way that land is managed, and we've kind of pulled the rug under certain parts of from under certain parts of the way our land was managed. And the other part of that is wildfire. Up until 2017, we were not dealing with million-hectare seasons, and so you've had these two massive changes, and the real question is, can our policy adapt to be responsive to this change? And I think it's a very difficult thing for a structured policy to do. So I recognize that's a non-answer, but that's one of those challenges I'm really, really grappling with at the moment and trying to wrap my head around is how we can accomplish effective dynamic management in a kind of the policy environment we live in today.
Yeah. I mean, I really just asked you, I was like, hey, so like, how is this all going to pan out? That's what I asked you. So it's fair that you had a non-answer. I had almost a non-question, right? It was, yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. I really hope that I'm excited at the existence of the Center for Dialogue, and that there's people like you and groups like yours out there doing this kind of stuff. Cause we need more of it. We just need it all the time, constantly. Even though a lot of people get tired of talk, we need action. It's like, well, okay, yes. But if we have consistent talking with action, then we can have the dynamic planning. We can have the dynamic management. They need to go hand in hand. We need to have action every year, and we need to have planning every year, collaborative planning, just sorting out what these definitions are and what they look like and how they can be collaborative and how they can work together to accomplish some larger understood, goal of dynamic landscape planning or resilience or whatever you want to call it, right? Healthy landscapes. And yeah, I'm just excited at this. It's just a really exciting space to know that this is happening now, and that we're coming together as humanity. We're all of humanity. We're all coming together trying to figure this out. What are we going to do? It's great. It's fantastic. We'll sing Kumbaya later. But yeah, do you have any final thoughts that you is something we missed, anything that you wanted to get out before we kind of wrap things up here? I always like to give people the space to freeball for a minute at the end.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. The first is all of this work I'm just a small part of, so I think it's also worth noting in the dialogue I was referring to, Dr. Kelsey Cope-Scurbitz, Dr. Robin Freeman, Francis Johnson, and Julian Griggs played a huge role in that. And then I'd also, I think, just other parts of the mitigating wildfire team would be Yolanda Clatworthy and Robin Prest. I think, yeah, it's been a real team effort to do this so far, and I think it's really worth thanking all of them. And I would just like to kind of highlight a little bit of the work that we're doing moving forward, because I think that's kind of ties into this. And yeah, very open to hear if listeners have any questions or want to be involved. The first piece of that is the networks, like I talked about. We're really hoping to build collaborative networks across the different actors in the wildfire space in British Columbia, and hopefully we'll be connected across Canada. We'll see how everything pans out, but I think that's a crucial part of what we're working on. Second is, once again, more of our Indigenous fire stewardship initiatives. So Tier 1 events and land-based learnings. And then finally, I'm working on a whole new series right now focused on how we can really align the incentives around wildfire management and mitigation with forest sector, and really how we can engage in a broader group and scale up that work. So just to kind of plug for some of our future work, that would be the main thing. But broadly, just thanks to you, and then thanks also to all the participants that have taken the time to come and spend a few days with us and engage in these conversations. It's always inspiring and exciting and educational.
Awesome. Yeah, man. Thanks for taking the time. This was such a refreshing conversation. I feel like I've been dabbling around these ideas for quite some time, and it's nice to just sit down and suss them out and see what someone like yourself who is so engaged in it is thinking and where things are at. So thanks for the time. Thanks for your effort. And I'm looking forward to keeping tabs on everything you get up to, because it's exciting stuff.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Man, that was a doozy. I love that. I can't wait to do more of this. This is great. Thank you, James, for all of your time, and to everybody that participated in those dialogues so that I could have this conversation with James. It was great. Can't wait to learn more and to see what's going to happen next, and see what that network of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary people looks like. It's going to be cool. And if you got questions for me or for James, shoot me an email at YourForest@gmail.com, and I will shoot them off to James. He can answer your question directly or through me, whatever we end up doing. And I know that they always look for more interesting ideas, right? And questions. They want to answer these things. They're trying to get information out, so they want to know. Ask the question, whatever it is. And I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.